Good afternoon. This is Dr. Thomas Klein. I am a rare and chronic disease specialist in Raleigh, North Carolina. I've been practicing general medicine for 42 years. And today we're going to discuss the worst problem we have in this country: denying treatment to people in pain. Opiates are derived from the poppy plant, from raw opium that oozes out of it. Been used for 4,000 years. It's basically a very safe and effective medication, triggering addiction in less than 1%, which can be handled simply by asking the question, you ever had an opiate before? Because our research shows that opiate disease is genetic. The reason there are no more percentage-wise heroin addicts today than there were in 1920 is for this reason. We've heard this before, but we have to keep reiterating it because this is one of the reasons that we have spent $1 trillion, that's $1,000 billion, over the past 100 years or so on wars on drugs that haven't worked. Nobody has sat down and said, how many cases of addiction have we prevented? How many cases of overdose have we prevented? The hysteria is just stunning. And we're going to tell a little story, a little parable here, about the barge to nowhere. In 1987, there was a man in New York who decided to start a little business hauling garbage in these huge barges or scows down to places in other states where they accepted trash into their landfills because the ones in New Jersey and New York were filling up. So the barge was hauled out of New York all the way down to the Cape Cod Canal, down to Morehead City, North Carolina, where they were going to accept it in a big landfill. A reporter comes out and looks at the big barge of 3,000 tons of garbage and says, hey, there's a bedpan on it. So guess what? People started to panic and said, this is a barge of medical waste. So North Carolina says, get out of here, you can't lay. So the guy is towing this barge with his tugboat, and he goes down to Louisiana, and they said, we heard you have medical waste on there, don't come here. So then he tows the barge across the Gulf of Mexico to Mexico, where they had a landfill that would normally accept, and they actually came out with a plane, a fighter plane, and told him to get out of the region. Went to Belize, same thing. So he goes back to Florida, and finally the EPA sends 5 people out in those white suits, and they climb all over the barge, and guess what? No medical waste. So they get off, and now he returns back to his origin in New Jersey, and a judge there ordered them to burn the garbage because it was medical waste. So finally, they dumped the garbage from where they got it after it was burned. So that is how fear gets started. It feeds on itself, and that's what's happened in this country. I have a problem currently with one of my patients who was on high dose and came from another state, and the distributor and powers that be from the government decided that he shouldn't be coming from another state. This is the latest red flag and it scares people. We call this barge thinking. There was no reason to be scared because people in other states are just like people in this state. You have to assume that everybody in other states are criminals and everybody in this state is fine. California will not accept prescriptions from any out-of-state doctors, assuming that every doctor in California is fine and every other doctor in the other 48 states are criminals. So he was rescued. A pain refugee was rescued, and his life was put back together with these miraculous drugs that are safe and effective. He was able to get a job. He was able to coach his 2 kids in their athletic activities. The problem is that being cut off because he's out of state made it difficult to find another pharmacy because he was a pain refugee, and they're finding it harder and harder to find pharmacies. Some pharmacies are hanging up signs, "We do not prescribe opiates." Nobody's done a study. My guess is that more than 3/4 of the pharmacies are not taking opiate prescriptions. And worse, they believe that high doses are bad, so they use the old 90 milligram, which we're going to talk about, to deny people their medications. So we have a mass denial of the ability to treat pain in this country. My patient is facing the possibility of not having any opiates for his painful disease. This man, after he told me a year later after I saw him, just missed a planned suicide that he had set up in his garage. And after the medication started, within a week, he became a normal person. I was talking to a lawyer today who said he had 6 weeks of pain after he cut down a tree in his backyard. He said the pain wasn't just pain, it affected his whole soul. And people don't realize that. The government thinks this is about low back pain. It's not about low back pain. This man, after I took him on and saved him with prescriptions that should have been written by any pharmacist and any doctor, may decide to use the equipment because he's now facing a life that existed before he was treated with these wonderful medications. So William Osler said these are God's own medications. So the group that is responsible for this, and I say responsible, maybe that's a little non-scientific, but we've decided at looking at this stuff at JATH that the terrible opioid crisis we have amongst people with chronic rare disease, which is 10 times larger than any perceived opioid crisis of heroin addicts, that if we did this, what would we have? My observations is every terrible thing that's happened has happened in the last 3 years. 42 years of practice, I can tell you, this did not happen before. So, this organization, PROP, or Physicians for Responsible Opioid Prescribing, a statement that's not quite true, but here's the FDA report that came back from this group petitioning the FDA to reduce and put limits on opiate pain medicine. I didn't know it at the time, but anybody can petition the FDA. So you go in there, and the scientists at the FDA looked at it, and they looked at this petition for several months. And here is the petition. This is the report from FDA back to PROP about their petition. And you can Google this and read it yourself. And if you do, the first part is very lengthy. Skip the part about long-acting drugs, LA drugs, and just kind of go to the next parts. Here is the FDA report. And here's what they said. FDA received 1,900 comments on the PROP position. However, the majority of the comments opposed PROP's requests. The professional societies that chimed in said that the data cited by PROP did not support their requests for limiting the dose. Professional societies also expressed concern the labeling changes were not supported by scientific evidence, and a one-size-fits-all approach wasn't really a good idea. Unfortunately, the point at which overdose death increases enough to change the benefit-risk ratio, this is what the CDC says. Well, you only taper if the risk-benefit ratio is bad, therefore more risk. But then they just paint the picture that there's a lot of risk. So guess what? There's kind of like no reason to use the opiates. So the cutoff point, so in other words, if they are a risk, there should be a number. Above what number the risk is worse, blah, blah, blah. But FDA says, and you can check it out, it's not just me, the threshold for increased risk of overdose death with these drugs could actually be considerably lower than the 90 milligrams or considerably higher than the 90 milligrams. And just to be a little confusing, the petition was for 100 milligrams, but it ended up being 90 milligrams. So that's how this got started. The FDA completely disagrees with any kind of limits. So now we're going to talk about limits next. Thank you.